Well, thanks, Michelle, and thank you for coming. I was a little worried when I saw the weather that we wouldn't have enough attendance today, but I'm glad you came out. I think entrepreneurship is fascinating, and I hope you think it's fascinating even after I'm done with this talk. Part of this is going to be autobiographical. Michelle mentioned that I have an interest in law and entrepreneurship, and when I started thinking about this, there was no such thing as law and entrepreneurship. When you looked in the law journals, people didn't talk about that as a concept. We recently formed the Law and Entrepreneurship Association, which is a group of scholars who study law and entrepreneurship, and that's been a development that's a long time in coming. And I wanted to give you a sense for the ideas that animate this field and why you might be interested in studying law and becoming an entrepreneurial lawyer or a lawyer who does entrepreneurship. So let me start with my own journey, which begins in the 1990s. And I've put up here some logos for some venture capital-backed firms from that era. That was Amazon's logo at the time and Yahoo's logo. I don't know if you are old enough to remember Netscape, but that was our big web browser at the time. And Cisco, of course, is still a company that's very big and powerful in Silicon Valley. I started teaching law in 1994, and I had come from a practice with a New York law firm. Most of our clients were large Wall Street companies, Fortune 500 companies, and my first teaching job was in Portland, Oregon, which was a very entrepreneurial town, sort of an odd town. If any of you are from Portland, I love Portland, but it's sort of got the right attitude to foster entrepreneurs because they think of the world a little differently there. And I noticed my students, who were mostly from the Northwest, were very much interested in practicing law among companies that were entrepreneurial companies. And I had come from an environment that was, as I said, sort of big companies and didn't fit as well in this culture. And so I had to retool a little bit to teach in that environment. And so I started to study venture capital. And during the 1990s, I was one of really only a couple of law professors who was writing about the venture capital industry. And it sort of caught on, as you know, in popular culture, but also among law professors. And then I sort of decided to move from just thinking about venture capital to moving to thinking about law and entrepreneurship more generally. That move really was facilitated when I went to the University of Wisconsin. I'm originally from Wisconsin, so if any of you are from the Badger State, I definitely want to meet you afterwards. But I grew up in Wisconsin, and Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin Law School advertised for a position. They were looking for a law and entrepreneurship scholar. And there weren't many of us around, and so they called me and asked if I would be interested in interviewing for the position. They didn't know at the time that I was from Wisconsin, and so it was sort of a happy surprise for both of us that they had a position that suited my interests and that I could go be closer to my family for a while. In the interview for that position, which was actually an interdisciplinary position, it wasn't just in the law school, but I had an appointment that had me interacting with folks in the business school and the economics department, engineering. I was part of an entrepreneurship cluster. And in that interview process, one of the professors from the business school said, "Why is it that you'd be interested in working in the entrepreneurship cluster?" And I said, "I'd like to create the field of law and entrepreneurship. It doesn't exist, and I think it ought to exist because entrepreneurship is an important phenomenon, and it's a phenomenon that has attracted the attention of business law scholars and economists and people in other disciplines, but lawyers don't think about it, and I think we should." And she told me many times afterwards that was sort of the clincher for her. That was what really made her want me to be part of the cluster because we wanted to develop the field. And so I went to the University of Wisconsin. I was there for 5 years. And at the end of that time, in my last year there, we hosted a conference called the Law and Entrepreneurship Retreat, which has become an annual conference of law professors who think about law and entrepreneurship. And that's part of the way we've tried to grow the field. So what is entrepreneurship? I don't know if any of you would recognize this famous economist. This is Joseph Schumpeter, an Austrian economist, who wrote a lot about entrepreneurship. And he thought of entrepreneurship as a distinct field of study. And as suggested by the quotation there, he tells us that the function, this entrepreneurial function, does not essentially consist of either inventing anything or otherwise creating the conditions in which the enterprise exploits. It consists in getting things done. So that's his definition of entrepreneurship. It's getting things done. And I thought, well, this is something I can run with, right? If this is about getting things done, that sort of becomes the focal point. We've reframed that a little bit. And I think most law and entrepreneurship scholars now think of it probably in this way, about getting novel things done, about doing new things, doing things that nobody's ever done before. And then we think of that really as about, we sort of encapsulate that in this little two-word phrase, entrepreneurial action. So what I study, and when you think about law and entrepreneurship, what we should think about is what we're really about is entrepreneurial action, people getting new things done. How does, and the really big question, this may be a joke that's too old for you, but what's law got to do with it? Okay, so that's Tina Turner who sang the sort of famous song, What's Love Got to Do with It? But it's a lot funnier with an older crowd. So and so that's the question that animates my studies of entrepreneurship. What does law have to do with getting novel things done? And what I'd like to do today is tell you a few stories about how law might facilitate the getting done of novel things, and then hopefully give you a sense for the field of law and entrepreneurship. So, first story is about actually a professor from the University of Wisconsin, and I never knew this professor, but his legend was large at the University of Wisconsin Law School. His name was Willard Hurst. And he was probably, in his day, was undoubtedly the most famous legal historian in the world, and was a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And he wrote a book in the mid-1950s called Law and the Conditions of Freedom in the 19th Century United States. Now, I don't know if that really grabs you, if you think, boy, I want to go out and get that volume. If you go look for it in our library, you'll find it's actually checked out to me, and it's in my office, so it'll cause you to come visit me if you want to read it. But Willard Hurst studied 19th century United States. That was his expertise. And what he noticed when he looked at people in the 19th century is that, of course, they were very industrious, entrepreneurial. He didn't use the word entrepreneur anywhere in the book. It doesn't appear because people didn't use the word in the 1950s yet. I'm not sure if it's apocryphal, but there is a story about George Bush saying sort of trying to, have you heard this story about he was trying to talk down the French and say that they didn't have much of an economy, he said they don't have a word for entrepreneur. So, you know, the word entrepreneur is a sort of foreign term to our language, but got introduced really quite a bit later, I think, to common parlance. So he doesn't talk about entrepreneurs, but he does talk about entrepreneurship. This is what he says. He says, the release of creative energy was the dominant value of 19th century legal policy in the United States. Now that's a pretty amazing statement to a legal scholar, right? So if you think about 19th century United States, throughout the 1900s, we've got really the founding and development of the United States. We have the Civil War during that time. There's a lot of stuff going on. What Willard Hurst says as a legal historian and a scholar of that period, he says, when I look at everything that's going on, what I see is people who are making laws are trying to release the creative energy of the citizenry. That's the dominant value of our legal system at the time. Well, this really caught my eye, of course, because what he's really saying is that our legal system was set up to promote entrepreneurial action. And how did it do that? So for Willard Hurst, it did that by providing a framework through which people would be willing to take risks. And so in his view, and this became, of course, sort of standard economic theory, the reason people are willing to take risks, and he used a word that I quite love, and it's embolden. The The reason people would be emboldened to take action is that the context in which they're acting is stable. They know that if they take action to enter a contract or buy some property, that property will in fact be theirs tomorrow, that contract will be enforced in a court next week or whenever they need that thing enforced. And so he says, if you have a stable legal framework, then you're likely to cultivate boldness and energy and action. So people will take risks, they'll invest in things, they'll do things. So this seems sort of unsurprising to us now, but I think at the time Hearst said it, it was a little bit more innovative in his thinking than it might seem to us today. So what do you have? You have stable institutions, courts, legislatures, administrative agencies, and that sort of thing. Hearst's goal, by the way, because he was a New Dealer, he had actually graduated from law school in the 1930s, was a big fan of the New Deal, and his goal was to show that the United States in the 19th century was not a land of without law. In fact, it was a land in which law structured the development of the economy. And so he was really trying to show that law was an important feature of economic development, and this was his thesis. He said that legal policymakers had a preference for dynamic rather than static property, or for property put to creative new use rather than property content with what it is. All right, so the legal system, he says, was designed to promote development. You didn't just buy land and sit on it. You did something with it. You developed it. You didn't just get a patent and do nothing with it. You exploited that patent. You did something with it. You commercialized it. And that was the impetus of the legal system at the time. And then he has this wonderfully evocative phrase. He said there was an impatient confidence in productivity. That is, at the time, what people believed is that if people simply did things, if they were productive, if they acted, if they were entrepreneurs, that good things would come out of that would improve everybody's lives, and that would work to the good of the country. So the laws were created with that in mind. Let's try to get entrepreneurs, let's try to get people acting as entrepreneurs. It wasn't, entrepreneurs were a special species of people who came born with a tattoo or a birthmark that suggested they were different than other people. Everyone was an entrepreneur, right? And so that was the attitude. So you can imagine why this caught my attention. Reading Willard Hearst, which I did really because I was at the University of Wisconsin, and he was such a legend. I wasn't really looking for stuff on entrepreneurship, but when I got my hands on this, I couldn't put it down, and it's become an important part of my thinking ever since. Okay, second set of stories. By the end of the 1800s, we get what were dubbed in the popular press the robber barons. So you may recognize Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, three of the more famous robber barons. Basically big businessmen, some big in stature, like J.P. Morgan was an enormous person, but also simply extremely wealthy. Where did their wealth come from? It came from mostly entrepreneurial activities, and of course some people said some illegal activities. You may have heard of the law of antitrust. The law of antitrust develops in the late 1800s as a response to the robber barons. At the time, corporate law was fairly undeveloped, and so John D. Rockefeller, for example, had oil. He owned Standard Oil, and to organize Standard Oil, he had to create a separate company in every state in which it operated, because you couldn't have operations outside the state in which you were organized. So he had corporations all over the United States, and he needed one centralized mechanism for managing those corporations. And at the time, corporate law didn't provide that mechanism, so he created a trust, and then all of the corporations were owned by the trust. And the trust was thought to be so abusive that regulators created a law to combat the trust, and that law was called antitrust. And so John D. Rockefeller was quite an innovator at the time in his own way. Eventually, the laws changed and to accommodate these large corporations. And so what we see is legal forms are developing to accommodate bigger and bigger businesses. Of course, as technology is changing, as transportation technology and communication technology develops, the need to communicate across bigger regions is followed by the innovations that enable that to happen, and we see bigger and bigger businesses forming during this time. Well, this is a concern to a lot of people, and so we get a little bit of a backlash. You hear about a lot of journalists who are writing about it during the late 1800s and early 1900s. One of my favorite pieces of work from this time is by a guy named Edward Bellamy. I don't know if any of you have read this book. It's still in circulation. It's called Looking Backward. And Edward Bellamy, I'll show you his picture. There he is there. Had quite a radical idea about what to do about this. So here's Edward Bellamy's world. Edward Bellamy's world is a world in which there are large corporations that employ vast numbers of people, but the people are largely working in what we would consider fairly abusive work environments. Their days are long, the conditions in which they're working are unsafe, and the pay is low. And so we have some attempts by employees at that time to organize into labor unions. To the extent they're successful, many of the people who are organizing end up putting pressure on the corporations at the time through labor strikes, and so there's a lot of management labor conflict at the time, and that conflict manifests itself sometimes in violence, but certainly in a lot of hardship. Edward Bellamy is from Boston. He sees this happening, and he decides to write this story, Looking Backward. Looking Backward is a novel, and it's a novel about a man who falls asleep in 1887 and wakes up in the year 2000. It's not clear how he's able to do that, but he wakes up in 2000 and he wakes up to a utopian society in which there's peace and harmony and prosperity abounding in the United States. And the book consists of this man talking to a person he finds about what has happened in the ensuing 113 years since he went to sleep that has created this utopian society. The thing that has happened, the one thing that Bellamy thought would change everything about the way the world works, is that we would take the large corporations of the day and we would make them into a single large corporation. So the thing that had happened is that everything had been nationalized. And so everybody would be an owner of the single enterprise that ran the world. It produced all of our food and energy and housing and took care of us. And this was, of course, our single unitary government. Now, Bellamy wasn't the only one thinking along these lines. In the 1800s, there are famous economists and philosophers who think along these lines. Karl Marx may be familiar to you as somebody who's sort of thinking along these lines. There are, of course, places that have tried this experiment of nationalization. What was surprising to me as I looked into this, because I didn't learn about this in my history class in high school, but what was surprising to me is how many people in the United States were on board. Bellamy was fantastically famous at the time. He would go around the country giving speeches on nationalization, and there was actually a political party that started, and this was their platform, to nationalize industry and make all industry into one big organization that would make us all happy. Okay, I'm not sure we need to spend a lot of time talking about why that's a horrific idea, but it is a horrible idea. Not peace and prosperity, but the means to get there, I think is really what Bellamy thought of was as a utopian novel. I think we would think of as a dystopian novel, that is a novel about a society that's quite dysfunctional. And law and entrepreneurship in particular, is quite the opposite of this, right? Rather than centralizing everything into a single company. Entrepreneurship is about decentralization. It's about giving people an opportunity to do something new and innovative, to undermine the old, to destroy the old and create the new. And to do that, you need a system in which people are available and where the availability of a new idea is possible. And the legal system can make that possible. To the extent our legal system suppresses that, my own view is that it's largely bad, right? That we should enable entrepreneurs to do that new thing rather than suppressing their ability to do that. You've heard of I know you've heard of capitalism. Many of you have heard of crony capitalism. The essence of crony capitalism is that large companies are able to use their largeness, their incumbency, to protect their position in the market. And to the extent we see that happening in our country or in other countries, those of us who are fans of entrepreneurship think that's a bad thing. Okay, third story. This is a story published in 2002 called Siberia Bound, Chasing the American Dream on Russia's Wild Frontier by Alexander Blakely. Again, a book that almost nobody has. I would be shocked if any of you have read this book. It wasn't an extremely famous book. I found it in a bookstore and when I was wandering around a decade ago, and thought, well, that looks interesting, and decided to read it. Here's the story. Alexander Blakely is a Minnesota native. He graduates from college, didn't have anything better to do with his life, so he moved to Siberia. The reason he moved to Siberia was that he was a Russian major, and he had gone to Siberia on a study abroad. He had met a young woman there, and that was enough. And so he went back, lived with the young woman for a while. He was actually in Siberia for 5 years, and this is a book about his experience. Well, what does a guy from Minnesota do in Siberia? He doesn't get a work permit. He decides to become an entrepreneur in Siberia. So he teams up with a Siberian named Sasha, and they do all sorts of things. They sell cocoa beans to a chocolate factory. They get into latex gloves. They have a potato business for a while. So all sorts of things, that basically anything that they can think of to make money. And it's a boom and bust story. So there are times when he just is absolutely rich in Siberia, and then there are times when he loses it all. One of the things he revels in, one of the things he praises Siberia for at the time. Now remember, this is 1990s Siberia, so this is shortly after we get the fall of the Soviet Union. There's basically no legal system. The court system functions to it does one thing pretty well. It kills people who commit wrongs that are worthy, in their view, of capital punishment. But it's not a system in which contracts are enforceable. In fact, I wanted to read you just a small excerpt from the book to get a sense for what it was like at that period of time. They were borrowing some money from a local lender. Local lender's not a bank, right? This is a guy who sort of want to borrow some money. So Sasha decides that they ought to have a contract for this loan. So they draw up a contract, and when they go to get the money, Sasha presents the contract to the lender. The lender slides the contract back across the table, and then this is how Blakely describes what happens next. Sasha, still grinning, ripped the paper lengthwise in two, then ripped the two halves into quarters, then into eighths. I felt drunk with emotion. In 2 days, we had sold 6 tons of chocolate and borrowed $20,000 without a single lawyer charging $200 an hour to put words on paper to protect us from any and every eventuality. Even better, there would be no lawyers to siphon thousands of dollars from us when an unforeseen eventuality did occur and a dispute arose, a dispute that only lawyers profited from. So he's got a fairly negative view of law in the legal profession, But the irony here, of course, is that he ends up losing everything he has, partly, I'd say mainly, because there is no law or legal profession to protect him. There are no courts or enforcement agencies that can help him when the Russian mafia comes to basically take what he has away from him. And so the legal system, unbeknownst to Blakely, actually never sort of comes to this realization in the book, is actually the things that gives, as Hearst says, that solid framework to the economy and allows the people who are entrepreneurs to flourish. Okay, story number 4. I want to tell you a little bit about the notion of opportunities. When you look at the entrepreneurship literature in business schools, among economists, sociologists, psychologists, many people talk about the notion of entrepreneurial opportunities. Opportunities is the core concept in entrepreneurship research. And there's something of a divide among entrepreneurship scholars about what an opportunity is. So one view of this is, again, this is, the picture is to illustrate a theory about what an opportunity is. One economist says it's like picking up coins on the beach, right? So you walk along and, oh, there you go, there's a coin, you pick it up. That's an entrepreneurial opportunity. That is, entrepreneurial opportunities are found, they are discovered. They exist in nature, and entrepreneurs are people who are just good at spotting those things that exist in nature. So that's one view of opportunities. I think it's largely, to the extent people think of opportunities as simply existing out in nature and being stumbled over by people who come along and happen to have an entrepreneurial mindset, it's probably an unprofitable way to think about opportunities. I think a better way to think about it is that opportunities are created. They are active creations of the entrepreneurs. That is, they are in the mind of the entrepreneurs. One of the great, what I think is sort of a great illustration of this, MIT had a technology, probably some of you or many of you are familiar with 3D printing. So the technology is created at MIT. They had a patent on this technology. Business law professor went in and created a bunch of teams and asked the teams to come up with ideas. What could they do with this technology? And I think they had 6 teams, and each team came up with a different idea about what they could do with this technology. The patent, some people might say, is a resource that is used to develop an opportunity, okay? So the patent is not the opportunity, but it's simply a resource that can be used to create the opportunity. The opportunities are, my screen went out here. Okay, there we go. The opportunities are the things that the entrepreneurs create with those resources. What do you do with the resources that you have? So why is it that this is so important? The reason it's so important is because when you have, and let's just think of this as a resource, when you have a resource, there are many things that you can do with that resource. The things that you do are the opportunities that you create. Now, when you think about when you think about entrepreneurship, this is the process. You have people taking resources and creating opportunities from those resources. To me, this is an exciting prospect that the opportunities are limited not by nature, but by our own imagination, and that entrepreneurs have an unlimited field of imagination from which to draw. So I've only drawn 3 opportunities here, but what I want to suggest to you is that the reason entrepreneurial action is so important, so all the way back to the beginning, what's really our focus of study is entrepreneurial action. Why is it important for people to go from the resource to the opportunity? Why do we want to encourage them to do that? Why do we want to train our children to do that? Why do we want to have our legal system encourage that sort of action? It's because when you get to that next place, there are whole new opportunities available to you. right? This is a concept called the adjacent possible, which has got to be the clunkiest name. We've got to come up with a new name for this. So if you can think of a new name, I'm happy to do it. A guy named Stuart Kauffman, who's an evolutionary biologist, came up with this idea. The idea is that we can't think about evolution in his world as just sort of a linear process, but the next step in any process is determined by the prior step. So once you take that next step, you have a whole new world of opportunities that weren't available to you before because you weren't at the place you are now, right? And so the idea behind entrepreneurship is that there is such a thing as the adjacent possible. The opportunity set expands as you pursue opportunities. All right, this insight caused us to create, co-author of mine and I created what we call the opportunity cycle. And it starts down on the bottom left-hand corner with resources. So you have some resource, and that resource results in the creation of an opportunity. Remember, the opportunity creation is in the mind of the entrepreneur. It is a creative act in the same way writing a novel or writing some music is a creative act. Coming up with a business opportunity, an entrepreneurial opportunity, is a creative act. And then when that act comes into fruition, when you actually make that act into a business, that's the exploitation of the opportunity. In the process of exploiting the opportunity, you create new resources. And the new resources are then used to create new opportunities, which are then exploited, and you have a virtuous cycle. Right? So this is the idea behind the opportunity cycle, is a virtuous cycle that becomes self-perpetuating. If you've ever been to an entrepreneurial environment, and we are quite entrepreneurial around here, and I think, of course, if you're from Silicon Valley, that was sort of the mecca of entrepreneurial environments, but there are lots of places other than Silicon Valley where you see this cycle in play. Now, some legal systems are better than others at encouraging entrepreneurs to think about ways to exploit resources. In the U.S., I think it's generally regarded as having a good legal system for encouraging entrepreneurship. Perhaps the best in the world. Certainly we have an entrepreneurial economy, and one that is the envy of many countries in the world. There are countries that aren't considered very entrepreneurial. France, as noted with the George Bush joke, is one. Germany, so continental Europe is not generally considered to be extremely entrepreneurial place. And of course, there are lots of places where entrepreneurship doesn't flourish because it's so unstable. When you have an unstable government, it's difficult for entrepreneurship to take hold. So one of the things that we do in law and entrepreneurship is we do comparative work. We look at the U.S. legal system and we compare it to France or Germany or to Japan or to Brazil, and we think about what are the features of our legal system that are useful and might be able to be exported to other places. It's a complicated process, but it's part of what we think about. So when entrepreneurial opportunities are exploited, the inventory of resources expands. This is that notion of the adjacent possible, and that lays the foundation for the creation of future opportunities. So we think the study of law and entrepreneurship is not just interesting, but it's important because it's important for people to have the ability to do new things to hopefully improve our lives. Of course, there are new things that people can do that won't improve our lives, and we hope that lawyers will be there to protect us against those things too. Okay, fifth story. Amazon.com. So I didn't talk about Amazon when I talked about 90s companies, but it was in some ways the quintessential 90s company. Could have only existed with the internet. So we have I want to talk a little bit about the resources and then sort of show you the opportunity cycle in action. So we have a Supreme Court case that says you can't tax internet commerce, right? So we get that case. We get the internet itself. So remember, early 1990s, this is a brand new thing. People are saying, wait a second, there are opportunities here. We have an internet. We have the ability to sell things over the internet, and if we sell things over the internet, we actually will have a competitive advantage over people who sell things in stores because we can do it without getting taxed or charging tax. We know there are books out there, and so here comes Jeff Bezos, who is a at the time an investment banker in New York, and he's putting all this together, and what he's saying is, I'm consulting with a lot of internet companies. I want to start an internet company. Maybe I'll sell books over the internet. That seems like it's a pretty good idea. The only problem was he wasn't the first one to have that idea. He was about the 10th one to have that idea. So he wasn't, Amazon.com wasn't the first bookstore, but Jeff Bezos, if anything, is an awesome marketer, and so he creates Amazon.com, and the tagline is Earth's Biggest Bookstore. That's their original logo, by the way, which is just, he obviously didn't get a graphics designer to help him with that. But that's, so that's an ugly piece of work. But that was the original Amazon idea. They were going to be the Earth's biggest bookstore. Now, I don't know if you shop at Amazon. It's clearly no longer just a bookstore, right? But what happened was the opportunity to create an internet bookstore is formed in Jeff Bezos' mind, and then he starts to exploit that opportunity. He goes to KPCB, gets some help with this, and then all sorts of things happen. He decides to allow for reviews of the products on the bookstore, and this turns out to be a masterstroke, right? Because people start writing reviews, they form a community, they feel part of this Amazon community. The feedback from customers is by other customers. And all of a sudden, we get all sorts of traffic to this site. We get innovations like the wish list, right, which was an Amazon innovation taken from real life, but placed on in the context of this store. One-stop, one-click shopping. Amazon actually has a patent on that. Okay, they created it and patented it. The one-click shopping, the whole notion of Amazon Associates. So we get all of these things. Their most recent innovation, Amazon Coin. I don't know if any of you own the digital currency at Amazon. It's not Bitcoin, but they're trying to do a sort of digital currency that you can use to buy products on Amazon. So what happens is you get the initial resources. Jeff Bezos comes up with an idea. That's the opportunity. He exploits the idea. As he exploits the idea, they get new resources, and then they start expanding. They go from books to hardware and clothing and basically anything you want. At the time, I remember hearing they were trying to do a deal to sell concrete over the internet, and I thought, these guys are crazy, right? But he really wanted to sell everything. And so now it's just the world's largest store. It's not just a bookstore. Okay, so what do we do with this study of law and entrepreneurship? And I want to just say a couple things about BYU. We teach classes in which we talk about law and entrepreneurship, and we train lawyers who can be entrepreneurial lawyers. Next semester, we'll be opening a law and entrepreneurship clinic in conjunction with the business school, and Lance Lenoff is going to be our supervisor of the clinic. So if you'd like to talk to Lance about what we're going to do there, I hope you'll be interested in that. We're going to try to help start up firms at the university, so student teams who are starting up companies, and we'll train the lawyers to help them start up those companies and get them going. We live in a very entrepreneurial culture, and so it's a great environment in which to study these things. And for my money, it's not only the most interesting thing you can study, it's one of the most important things you could do as a lawyer to help people to achieve their dreams through entrepreneurship. Thanks very much.